everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Turn It Up virtual conference. My name is Amy Hubbard and I am a director and co-founder of Capia. Before we commence today's session, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we join today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Just so you're all aware, we are recording today's session. For those who would like a copy or you'd like to circulate it to your friends and family, you'll need to sign up to our newsletter, and the link will soon be dropped in the chat at the bottom of the screen. So we're here today to talk with Dr. Rebecca Huntley about her book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. It's a big book. I've read it twice in the last few months, and it really sat with me, and I think that's probably why we're here today and we've had such huge interest in this session. So in terms of today's format, it's very much a conversation. I have some questions for Rebecca, and you will also have the opportunity to ask your own questions. During the discussion, please post your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Due to the size of the audience today, we may not be able to answer all of your questions, so please vote for your favourite by giving it a thumbs up or post your own. Also, feel free to share any comments or resources in the chat function with each other. So it's now time for a proper introduction. We've got Rebecca there. So to be honest with you, Rebecca, your bio was so extensive. I've just got a few headlines.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than sitting through one's long bio. It's embarrassing.
I really, the fact that you've written for Vogue, that resonated with me on a personal level, but maybe not everyone here today.
No, and I'm not a great ambassador for Vogue because I'm moving house. So thank God it's Zoom and not in real life today.
Is excused. So Rebecca is one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. And if you work in social policy or community engagement, you probably know of Rebecca and the work that she does. She's got a background in publishing, academia and politics. Rebecca holds degrees in law and film studies and a PhD in gender studies. Rebecca currently heads Vox Populi Research as part of the Circa Research Group. You're on the board of the Bell Shakespeare Company and a board member of the Whitlam Institute, and you're the mother of 3 girls and live in Sydney. Yes, that's a little bit about you. All right, let's get started, everyone. So, Rebecca, what happened to you in late 2018? Let's start at the very beginning.
Well, I woke up one morning and like a lot of mums of small kids, I try and wake up before everybody wakes up to be ready for the onslaught. And I sat down on the couch and turned on the television, and it was the day after, I think, the second students' strike for climate. And I watched these kids who were not much older than my eldest daughter talk about, so have the, not only protesting with these very funny signs, these very moving signs, and I just felt at that moment a really profound sense that they were speaking to me and my generation, to the parent generation, and perhaps that was a recognition that I'm old now. And there was a moment where I thought, and I actually still get emotional 2 years later, where I thought, this is actually something that they're saying do something. We don't have the power to do anything. We're here at school working really hard for a future that is uncertain and actually quite terrifying. For the parents and grandparents of the world who have their, are in positions of power or have a platform, do something. And I wouldn't consider myself to be powerful, but I do a lot of research for people who can make significant decisions around climate change, and I have a platform through media. And so I sat down on the couch as somebody who was academically concerned about climate change and got up from the couch as someone who has made a commitment for really the rest of my professional career to focus my work on not just understanding how people feel about climate change, but what we can do about it, how we can effectively communicate with different groups of people to really move the dial on action around climate change.
Can I just ask you, so when you got off that couch, how did the people around you respond to this deviation in, like, you know, you were that person sitting down and a different person getting up? So the people, you know, immediately around you, were they comfortable with your decision?
Look, you know, what I would never have guessed is it brought about quite a significant shift in identity. And the relationships around me. So for my most of my career had been as a researcher. My political activism had been within the Labor Party and the union movement, which has not always had a very comfortable relationship with climate change. I mean, that is changing, which is great. So I remember going out, you know, to dinner with some friends a couple of weeks later and saying, I'm going to have the vegetarian meal. And they said, why? I said, well, whenever I can choose not to eat, I still eat meat, but when I choose not to eat it, I don't. And they're like, oh, something's happened to you. And, you know, it also brought about some really quite difficult conversations with family and friends about things like where I wanted to live, what I wanted to drive, how much travel I wanted to do, a range of different things. And you know, and then also what I found myself doing is working with very different groups of people broadly in the environment movement, which is something that, again, I hadn't had a lot of engagement with, and the adjustment about that. So it was a profound, not just a profound kind of redirection of my career, but also profound rethinking of my relationships around me. And, you know, I got a tattoo, which I've never, I mean, all of this points to some kind of midlife crisis, but it hasn't been. I kind of felt like I needed, the tattoo is an S. All of my 3 children have S starting with their name. And I felt like, you know, this is a commitment I've made professionally, but also as a mother, to do my best to be part of a movement trying to create a livable world for our kids. And I almost felt like I needed some kind of physical thing inside me to keep me anchored and focused on that. So, look, I'm almost, you know, the change in my life in the last 3 years has been profound, but incredibly rewarding. But yeah, it was unexpected, those kinds of new conversations I was having with people that could often be very uncomfortable. And I work through those challenges in the book as well.
Really, really inspiring, Rebecca. So let's get to the crux of your research, your work, your new book. Why do we find it so hard to talk about climate change, especially in our personal life with those family and friends? Why is it so hard?
So I think what we have to acknowledge is that it's not surprising that it's difficult to talk about climate change. When you think about the science and you think about what's driving climate change, it is profoundly scary. And of course, the cause of this is, to some extent, the lifestyle that we have become accustomed to, that we don't necessarily want to decouple from. You know, and we want to be able to, and still people in the movement, I don't want to be able to give up the life I live, the lifestyle I live. So it is a really challenging question. It also brings up a whole range of issues in terms of fairness, unfairness, profound inequalities across the world. So big geopolitical issues around science. And if you look at the PISA rankings, you know, there's very few countries in the world that are doing great in terms of science education. So once you start a conversation about climate change, it pricks in people that sense of, oh, I don't understand the science, it's big, it's global. There is no enemy, really. I mean, some people would, there are certainly barriers to progress, but there's no enemy in the way that previously there have been with other kinds of challenges. You know, it's not like a Cold War or a World War. But I think also what's happened in places like Australia, the United States in particular, I mean, the United States and Australia stand out globally as 2 countries with significant percentages of climate deniers in positions of power. A discussion that keeps going around climate change, around climate denial, even though there is only still a small percentage of people in the community in both of those countries who are climate denialists. So when climate change gets brought up, it seems like it's a divisive political issue rather than a policy, advocacy, science issue. And so it makes people uncomfortable. It's almost easier to talk about religion and sex in Australia than it is to talk about climate change. And so there has been a pervasive climate silence in the majority of the population for some time because of this politicisation, because of the innate scariness of climate change as an issue, and because it connects to so many other difficult things that are hard to talk about in our society. So it's surprising that we do talk about it given all of those challenges, and unravelling that is a huge task.
Yeah, and a huge task for, I'm just thinking about a lot of the local governments we work with in Victoria, and we'll get to that in a minute. But, they're trying to facilitate these large-scale conversations about what climate change is, how it impacts on a local level and what their constituents and communities can do. And they're struggling because it is such a journey, and that journey looks so different for every one of their community members, or can look quite different.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to come back to your book. You say it took you longer than it should have to realise that science isn't enough to convince people about climate change. So what else do people need to make people change their beliefs and behaviours? What else do they need other than the science?
Look, the science has got us far enough, in Australia, United States and across the world. You've got the vast majority of people in the vast majority of countries believing that the science around climate change and that people are contributing to climate change and something needs to happen. So the science communication has done well, but it's probably reached its limit. Because in the end, what we need to do is be able to connect the science to people's lives. So it's really quite clear in all of the work that's been done around this question, and an emerging and exciting area of climate change communication, with psychologists coming in, political scientists saying that the starting point of that making the science the starting point of the conversation around climate change means people get a bit bored, weirdly, even though they haven't necessarily absorbed the ramifications of the science. They feel like they've heard the script. And this is what comes out in groups all the time. What is often better, and what is tricky, because it's not a broadcast message, is to start in whatever group you are or community where you are, where you talk about what is it that you value in this community, what brings this community together, and also what do you want to retain in this community, whether it be places, people, jobs, whatever that might be, the character of that community. What is important to protect because you value it in the future? That can be a very big and open starting point. And then from that, it's about charting a path from that conversation with, well, how does that connect both with climate change, i.e., how does climate change threaten the things that we value in the community we live with, and how do climate solutions contribute to protecting the things that we love? And that community doesn't have to be place-based. It can be professional. It can be based in a professional concern, a life stage that you're going through. It can connect to a hobby or anything that you love. And I think that when we are able to educate people not just about the science of climate change, but the extraordinary possibilities in climate solutions through a conversation about what is it that the community values. This is why the work that you're doing and everybody on this panel is doing around making community engagement, like improving the way that we engage with communities, and is so critical. It's actually, the process here is as important as either the starting point or the outcome.
Thanks, Rebecca. So let's go back to your book. You take the reader through a journey of emotions, and just for those who haven't read the book, from guilt to fear and anger, denial, despair, hope, loss and love. Can you talk us through the emotions of climate change? And I know there's a lot in there. Love has really kind of stuck with me personally, but yeah, can you talk through some of those emotions?
Yeah, and look, it was interesting working through them because even though I'd spent about a year and a half researching the book, for various reasons, I had to write it relatively quickly, at least the first draft, in 6 weeks over the period where Australia was burning the fires of last summer. So sitting in my study with no air conditioning, I can tell you that I went through the various, as I watched the fires kind of unfold across the country, I went through these various stages from kind of fear to anger to despair, grief, hope, love, loss, the whole process. I suppose, just to summarise, what was interesting going into the book is I thought that some of those negative emotions, or how we normally define as negative emotions, things like fear and anger, was going to be a problem. Like fear and anger in communications about climate change are a barrier, or guilt, for example. And actually I found that they can be useful, and we have those emotions embedded in us because they are useful, but they have to be used in a certain context and sometimes used sparingly. And then I also thought that I'd end the book on hope, but I didn't. I ended it on love, because hope is a really tricky emotion when it comes to climate change. Because if we hope that Elon Musk is going to solve the problem, or if we hope that the climate science isn't quite correct and this will be all like the Y2K bug, then that hope is really problematic. And in fact, in the end, I ended up on love, because love is the beginning and the end of the conversation around climate change. What do we value? What do we want to keep protected? What do we want to gain in accessing the extraordinary opportunities around climate solutions? Love is the beginning and love is the end. And whether you call it love, whether you call it care, whatever you call that, the values of that community, the things that make that community unique, that is the beginning and the end. And those other emotions can be used at different times, depending on the group, depending on the issue, and depending on what you want to get them to do. Because, I mean, you'll take the strike for climate. It has to be equal parts of fear and anger that get kids to put down their iPads and make handmade signs and take to the street. There's a little bit of, the collective and the values of your peer group as well, and the pressure of the peer group. But that's when something that a combination of fear and anger was incredibly affecting. And I meet lots and lots of men and women of my generation who were, where that was a really kind of turning point for them. For some people, the fires and the fear and anger and despair and sense of loss around the fires has mobilised them. So that was a real revelation, that sometimes these negative emotions can have positive outcomes. And that hope isn't everything, but that the inspirational quotes around hope are not necessarily always helpful when it comes to climate change, but love is.
Okay, so we're here today, lots of community engagement professionals in the room, hundreds from around the globe. Hello to our North American colleagues. We've got Canada, USA, we've also got New Zealand, we've got people from Singapore. So we've all got different challenges in working with communities around climate change or having a conversation about climate change. But what advice do you have for community engagement practitioners? It might be more at a principles level. Like where do they start? They've been starting for a while, and there's definitely some success out there. But at a principles level, where do they start?
Yeah, well, I think this is the challenge, isn't it? Because there are some broad principles, I think, but how that plays out in different communities will change. And of course, I've had some experience with things like citizens' juries and deliberative democracy, and that can work in some cases, depending on the community and depending on the question put to the community. But going back, and I think Gayatri has some interesting questions, interesting kind of comments to make around the importance of storytellers. And in fact, and I can share this link with you later, Amy, to share with the participants. There's some fantastic work coming out of the Yale program on climate communication. They've been running something called the Six America Study for about 12 years. And more recently, they've been interested in the power of personal storytelling to cut through essentially what are the partisan politics and of climate change, because people expect, the expectation is that people get a science script and a partisan script on climate change. And they've been talking about the impact of surprising stories from surprising storytellers. And where I've seen that work particularly effectively in Australia, and with some parallels in places like America where politicisation of climate change is so extreme, is from farmers. Because in Australia, traditionally, and I think it's probably the same in America, people who come from rural and regional areas much more likely to vote Conservative, much more likely to be seen to be Conservative, and also to react to the kind of culture wars around, climate change. But there is something extraordinarily powerful to hear from a third or fourth generation farmer talking about the changes on their land, talking about the desire to continue to stay on that land and farm it, having to change quite dramatically because of climate change, and how that relationship has made them look at the climate change issue differently. And so we have some really powerful storytellers in Australia around the Farmers for Climate movement. There's a obviously really powerful and much more ancient tradition of First Nations people talking about that how they have seen changes in the land happen and how they would like their approach to land management and the environment taken on more by the non-Indigenous culture. So I think that starting with storytelling is really critical. And then, of course, it goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the way that you make climate change real, relevant, and immediate to people is having a larger conversation about what is it about their community that they value? What do they see that might be slipping away under threat? And how do they imagine their community that ideally would like to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And so, again, that kind of personal storytelling, that community collective storytelling is always a really, really good start when it comes to this.
Okay, so let's flip the focus onto the other side. Working in community engagement, we often, unfortunately, well, not always the case, I shouldn't say that, but we have to navigate elected representatives, shapes, sizes, backgrounds, places, who have diverse understanding and views around climate change. Do you have any advice in working with our local councillors?
Navigating is a really good, navigating is an excellent verb, I think, a very diplomatic verb here, Amy. So as you made a conversation, you talked before about, particularly in Victoria, and a lot of my work, my consulting work in the last couple of months has been with a lot of Victorian local councils, but also in South Australia, thinking about, okay, so how do we talk about climate change with this particular local government area? I think there's a couple of interesting things that I've found that have been really effective is that, particularly in terms of how to deal with councillors, internal champions who are not elected representatives in the council are your best guide, and working really closely with them. And I've had some really interesting experiences with councils where some councillors have wanted a climate emergency declared through the council and they've lost, but the local government broadly has thought, okay, we're not going to have a climate emergency for whatever reason, maybe because that's not palatable for some more conservative members of the council, but how can we continue to act on climate? And I often say it doesn't matter whether you've declared a climate emergency or not, it's how you follow up. So how do you have that conversation? And I think that, and then I've worked also with councils that have done that. I think what works in Australia, and I couldn't, given I'm not an expert in the kind of broad character of other cultures, but there is something really powerful about just a practical approach to the problem that works with everybody. And so working out how to say, look, let's try and set aside the politics. What is the most practical way to approach this question, and pragmatic? Australians are extraordinary pragmatists, and I think, again, thinking with those different kinds of elected representatives, what is the surprising group of messengers that you can mobilise to access those people, right? And this is where I think, particularly in Australia, some of the most surprising messengers often do come from the supposedly more conservative side of politics. So whether they be farmers, whether they be small business people, whether they be, people who you wouldn't expect would care about climate change, coming and talking to these elected representatives and saying, this is where we see the community benefit from this. Forget about Al Gore's PowerPoint and the politics. This is how we're going to benefit from this. And then, of course, in Australia, one of the things we're seeing is the rise of really quite powerful disruptors in politics in independents, like so people outside the party political system who've been turned off by the two parties because of action on climate change. So we see people like Helen Haynes and also Zali Steggall. And so you can also find a way to say to these elected representatives, this is, you're either on this train or not. And there are ways you can make that work, both for your political career and also for the constituents and the constituency groups that you would normally speak to. So it's about trying to find a way indirectly to get to them, sometimes rather than directly, whether it's through a really good partner, really sophisticated public servants who really want to get some goals, reach some challenges here, or talking to, again, surprising messengers that are going to get through to them rather than necessarily always through the environment movement. Not always the best way to get to conservative political representatives, that's for sure.
Very sound advice. Now, I've got one more question before we throw it to the floor. So just to audience members today or participants, if you'd like to ask a question, just go down to the QA function and put it in there. So one final question from me. I've heard about your challenge to the social research profession.
Yeah.
They're very much our cousins, or maybe, older sibling, more established sibling of ours. Can you describe the challenge to the audience today?
Yeah. So when I first joined social research and I worked for Ipsos, I was told that we didn't do work with tobacco companies, which I thought was good. And mainly it was because we did a lot of healthcare work. But I realised that for a lot of professional services firms just made a decision not to work for tobacco. And that's mainly because the social licence was, tobacco, certainly in Australia, nobody can defend it. And for a while, I was starting to see the rise of professional organisations, whether it be engineers, architects, veterinarians, healthcare workers, band together either through their professional organisations or individually to say, as a group, as a profession, we want to ask more searching questions of our clients. We want to think about our practices and think about how we can make a contribution to climate change as professionals. And I put out a challenge to social and market research and say, well, if we say that we largely won't do work for tobacco, which is a legal product, but we don't do it because we don't think it's good for the health of the nation, then why are we saying that there's a natural but not completely equivalent extension to fossil fuel companies? And was just a challenge to think about, what is it about our practices, what are the questions that we ask our clients, particularly given a lot of our clients, whether that be in financial services, insurance, FMCG, are taking climate change quite seriously and environmental questions quite seriously. This doesn't necessarily mean boycotting work for fossil fuel companies, but it's asking more serious questions of ourselves as professionals and our companies that we work for ongoing. And of course, if anybody in the HR area will also say that for younger graduates, even at a time of COVID, they're coming into professional services firms asking, what kind of work do you do? And I've even met some HR people who say that they've had, engineers and architects who say, I won't work for fossil fuel companies. That's not what I want to do. And so if we're going to take things like corporate responsibility and corporate citizenship seriously, we should be starting to ask these questions if we take climate change seriously. So it's trying to start that conversation in my professional networks.
Very important conversation, Rebecca. We're going to move now to the questions in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Anonymous. What are some of the countries that are doing well in this space, having conversations with their communities?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things we were talking about before with Amy, one of the things that's really interesting to me is that Australians particularly think that what so-called developing countries, or countries that aren't quite as affluent or technologically, advanced as us, aren't doing as well on climate change. But that's actually not the case. You go to places across Africa, Latin America, and they're not having conversations about whether climate change is happening or not, or should we head in the direction of renewables. They're just doing it. Costa Rica is getting close to 99% of all of their energy being generated by renewable energy. You've got a really kind of, extraordinary uptake of things like microgrids across different parts of Asia. You've got African countries quite comfortable with being able to say, and let's face it, African countries that aren't necessarily already electrified, because they don't all necessarily countries where their wealth is reliant upon exporting fossil fuels, but they're just kind of going ahead and doing it because the technology is allowing you to do that. I mean, what's also really fascinating is that in places in the United Kingdom and other places, and Scotland and various other places, they don't seem to have quite the divisive politics of climate change as we do in Australia and the United States. And perhaps that's because the politics of coal kind of worked its way through that system around the coal miners' strike and various other kind of industrial disputes in the 70s and 80s. And now they're just going ahead and doing it and really having some quite effective conversations at the local government level, again, at that very local level about, what's the most appropriate way that renewable energy might play itself out here and what jobs might it create and all the rest of it. So I think that in some ways, the community engagement has been less important in these other countries because it hasn't been so politicised. They just gone on and done it. When the technology has been available for them to do it, they've done it. In places where climate change becomes more politically divisive, we do need more sophisticated tools for community engagement to work through it and to embolden political representatives to say, yes, there is community, there is, community consensus, there is social license for us to go ahead. So, I mean, that's the thing that's always, in the book, talking to activists from around the world, they just think, I just can't understand why your conversation around climate change is still tethered in denialism. They're just quite shocked. So,
yeah, and a lot of us here today are still quite shocked. I'm going to move to our good friend Max Hardy's question.
Hi, Max.
Max is in Fitzroy in Melbourne. So Rebecca, have you undertaken some research on the implications of people turning from being a climate denier in terms of being rejected by their tribe? It can be really tough for people to express concern for climate when they might be rejected from the dominant voices in their local community, which I've observed in northern Queensland.
Oh, no, that's absolutely right. And in fact, when somebody, there have been examples, I think, of, I don't use the term lightly, but bravery of people making a decision to speak out about climate in a community where they have absolutely no idea how they're going to be responded to. This is something that I've talked a lot about with those people who run things like Farmers for Climate. And this is why the emotional and social support provided by organisations for them is much, much harder. It's much easier for me to sit in the inner west of Sydney behind the turmeric latte curtain and talk about climate change. It really is not a lot of risk to my social connections at all. I think this is why it is absolutely critical for when we look at people who politically we don't have an enormous amount of in common with, but choose to speak out about climate change, why we are really, it's absolutely necessary that we continue to support them. So whether that be, for example, faith leaders where we might disagree on some other social and political issues, but they're speaking out strongly on climate, it's absolutely critical to amplify those voices. Because, of course, once the climate silence is broken in that community, there are surprising, advocates that will come out. It says everybody's sitting there thinking, do I have to speak about it? So, and of course, the other thing that I've talked about I talk about whenever I get the opportunity is the conservative politicians in Australia that talk about the changes, about their commitment to climate. So whether that be in New South Wales, we have a Minister for Environment, Matt Cain, who continues to speak out quite strongly about climate change and renewables. And for people who are overseas peers, that can be almost like putting a target on your back if you're in the conservative parties, if you talk about climate change with any kind of seriousness. But that's changing. And we've even had other people who've talked about other political representatives, particularly at the state level, who've talked about that transition and talked about it publicly. And it's quite a lot to stand up and talk about that change of mindset and heart, because you lose a bit of, it's much easier just to continue to hold the line and say you've always believed it. So I think that Max is exactly right. We have to recognise the social cost of people who are in communities where climate change is not something that's ever talked about, and surveys show there's not a lot of support for it, who choose to speak out. But when they do, they often talk about that other people come and speak to them and say, I never feel that. And so you build momentum. So those are, and then for the rest of us who may not necessarily be people of faith, people who vote conservatively, or people that agree with other political views of these people, it's up to us to amplify those voices. And that's how I'm on Twitter, which is not my funnest experience of the world. But what I do is those are the people I retweet. I try my best as much as I can to amplify those surprising voices on climate, to show that this shouldn't be an issue of politics. It should be an issue of science, technology, community well-being and advocacy.
Okay, great response, Rebecca. Thank you. Question from Anna. How do we get internal council staff on board to take action on climate change for a council that has rejected climate emergency?
Yeah, it is really, really difficult. And so I have been involved a bit in some of at a council level about working out the ways around doing that. And sometimes it's talking less about climate change and more about protecting green spaces, biodiversity. I often come on in those kinds of contexts and say, look, there's a spectrum of people's attitudes about climate change, but let's set that aside. Here's the support for renewable energy. Here are the opportunities here. This is what unites all these groups who might think very differently about the science and the timeline. These are the things that really matter to them. Clean air, healthy soils, healthy water, green spaces, particularly in a time of COVID. Can you imagine going through, for all my Victorian friends thinking of you at this time, but can you imagine going through lockdown without the ability to socially distance and walk to a green space or to go to a national park? I mean, that would be almost unbearable. So you can think about try to find a way to say, well, what does the research tell us about what actually unites us? Let's pull the politicised climate change language to the background, and what actually unites all kinds of people. And in fact, I've spent many, many years talking to climate deniers who all have solar panels on their houses and water tanks. And then also think about, well, what again, the interesting community activists that might be brought into the conversation. And so I've done these panels with councils that have rejected climate emergencies. With one guy was a local historian who had a particular interest in bird life in that community and talked about how that had changed over time and what we needed to do to make sure that wasn't continuing to be an issue around at something that changed. And that was something that everybody did love, regardless of how they thought about climate change. They loved the birds, they loved the natural wildlife in their area. So again, it's thinking about what are our other pathways around the political landmines that are so entrenched in the climate conversation. And then if you can show that that's effective to council staff, and that they're not going to get too much, the horrible hate emails and the phone calls, and that people get value from that conversation, then they feel a little bit more confident that they're not, unleashing a kind of a world of pain around the politics of climate change.
Thank you. Now, I've got a question from Raywin Kaora from New Zealand. I work in comms for a transport-focused government agency. We've introduced a sustainability action plan and my job is communicating this. Do you have any tips and tricks in avoiding climate change jargon? This talk is amazing and I need your book, and the link is now in the chat. So.
So transport's really interesting, and I think that transport, so we know that the vast majority, that the large issue is around, fossil fuels. Transport is also a really kind of interesting area. And again, it's one of those things where everybody loves the idea of effective public transport, but doesn't always, there's always kind of barriers to take up. Look, one of the things that I found really interesting in the work that I did, and again, this you would have to, this is why that local, that sophisticated community engagement and local approach is so important. Understanding what is it about the climate change script that turns people off, and working about how much of that do you have to leave in and take out to get them to do the thing you want them to do. So if the thing that you want them to do is value public transport, use it more effectively, support its, support a more sustainable transport network in relation to things like renewable, electric buses and all the rest of it. Part of that's working out, well, what is the unique value proposition that's going to be useful to them? Is it around more effective? Is it going to be more financially effective? So, not driving up rates. Is it going to be, a contributor to less air pollution, less noise pollution, any of those other kinds of questions? What has been really clear for people who fall into that, so people who aren't kind of hardcore climate deniers or people who aren't already on the climate change bandwagon, is for most people in the middle, they have a concern about climate change, but they want climate action to benefit their community now, regardless of what happens with emissions. So focusing on that value proposition is really important, and working out what language turns people off. And I found almost universally that the thing that turns that group off is too much projection to what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years' time. That's not to say that we're denying that is the possibility, but it just stops that conversation. If you can talk about the value that this is going to bring today to a whole range of different organisations, the community generally, it doesn't always have to be a monetary value. It can be a broader quality of life, way of life value, that happens, and also we just happen to be addressing this future issue, then that can often be a better way of doing it. The other thing I think is critically important too for people we need to convince is not placing too much personal responsibility. So making a space for personal behaviour change and personal action. But one of the biggest problems and biggest barriers is this whole idea that if I don't keep a cup or recycle my waste, that suddenly I'm responsible for climate change, right? Let's put the responsibility with the people with the most power. As soon as you start making climate change action about the individual decisions I make as a person in my household every day, then that is too much for most people, and it's a disengagement. So how can you create an opportunity? How is it, as an organisation, you create an opportunity for people to step in and do things rather than just it's all on you? And that can also be, a big turn-off.
That's all we've got time for, Rebecca. Thank you so much. There's many more questions there, but my advice to audience today is buy or borrow a copy of the book. They're in most local libraries. I did some research.
They definitely are. And if you every time you request it from a library or borrow it, I get a little bit of money, and that's more important to me, that people read it and you keep using your library than if you buy the book.
Yeah.
Just don't tell my publisher that I say that to you.
I'm definitely not recording this, Rebecca.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your time. Good luck moving house properly.
Thank you very much.
And hopefully we'll see you again, because you've got so much to contribute and help community engagement practitioners do the work that they love, which is about making a difference to people's lives. So thank you
so much. I really enjoyed it.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.